to record here. Okay, and then I'm going to introduce our guest. So our guest is Joan Hogan, and Joan is located in Tacoma, Washington, and you're a registered dietitian, is that right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And she is in practice working with nutritional counseling and has also done a lot of work on neurological conditions and nutrition and diet. And she's written a book, which I have back here, but I'm sure she'll talk about it. And she's just going to talk about eating for a healthy brain and eating with Parkinson's, and take your questions and answer some of the things that she can and give you tips and advice for eating for your best life living with Parkinson's. So Joan, thank you so much for being here. We love to have you present this information. This is a great topic.
Yeah, great. It's very fun. Okay. Everybody
right.
see nutrition? You see that there? Okay. So now what I understand is that most of you are fairly newly diagnosed with Parkinson's. And so one of the things that I always like to say when I begin these talks is that part of any kind of chronic disease is, I think, you need to become your own expert. I'm here to share information, and if this is your first talk on nutrition, I hope it's not your last, because these areas in Parkinson's disease are constantly changing. And so just keep that in mind as we talk, and don't quit learning, because nothing's set in stone. That's the exciting thing about Parkinson's disease. All sorts of new research is happening.
Hey, Joan, I'm going to interrupt you just a second.
Sure.
I forgot to say this. I'm going to mute everybody so we cut down on background noise. So you're probably going to have to unmute yourself in just a second, but I'm going to mute everybody. But then if people have questions, you can either type them into the chat or you can unmute yourself to ask questions, okay? But I'm going to mute all just so if the dog barks or the phone rings, we don't get that interruption. So muting everybody and then unmute yourself, Joan.
Okay. Okay, good. So did everybody hear the first part of what I talked about then, or do I need to repeat that?
No, everybody heard the first part.
Oh,
you
okay.
You were good.
Oh, okay, good. Okay, and let me know if I'm making noise. I do have a little heater in my office because it's very cold in here. So I turned it down, but if it makes noise, let me know. Okay, so we're going to discuss some of the things that I want to cover today are just knowing what are the best foods for you to start eating now, and what are some changes you can implement even today. And I want to talk a little bit more about digestion, because this is tending to be a pretty hot topic with Parkinson's disease, what is happening on a gut level. And I also want to review medications and that are related to diet, and also supplements. People with Parkinson's disease in general, if they look statistically, tend to gravitate towards trying different supplements, which is fine, but it can be expensive. And so what I want to do is help direct you where you might consider supplements. You don't have to, but where you could. And I know you've had some talks in the past, I think last week, on kind of the medical part of Parkinson's, so I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but just as a little bit of a review, is that Parkinson's disease originates in this itty bitty teeny part of the brain called the substantia nigra. And that is where it all begins. That part of the brain quits working, quits producing dopamine. And a lot of the research and lifestyle and diet is all circled around this little tiny area of the brain, and how we can preserve the function of, or decrease the deterioration of people with Parkinson's disease by controlling these aspects with medication, lifestyle, nutrition. And the other part that, like I mentioned, is getting quite a bit of input is our gut. And you hear a lot about the gut. You can open any magazine and you'll hear something about the gut and nutrition. And basically what we're looking at here is that our gut is full of all different kind of bacteria. And that bacteria, a lot of it is very good bacteria. And we realize it can promote signaling in different parts of the body, even the brain. And so it's really important that we feed the healthy bacteria. And I'll talk a little bit about that. And also some of the side effects, and maybe some of you have experienced this already, such things as constipation. And so I want to just touch on that a little bit too. So I want to just, this is a study I often go back to because it's probably the best information we have out there. There's a lot of research that's been done on diet, but I like this article written by Laura Mishley, which she continues to work on as we speak. She's collecting a lot of data from people with Parkinson's disease and accumulating those lifestyle factors which seem to be related to the progression of Parkinson's disease. And it also mirrors a lot of smaller studies, but her study is what we call longitudinal, which means it's constantly tracking people and what they're doing, what they're eating, their social situation, and their exercise. And so the things that she consistently is showing in her study is that adding a lot of fresh vegetables, fresh fruits, nuts, seeds, fish, non-fried, olive oil, wine in moderation, we will talk about that, coconut oil, any of your fresh herbs and spices, all seems to be associated with a decrease in progression of Parkinson's disease. And foods that tend to have more of a influence on increasing the progression include canned fruits, canned vegetables, diet and non-diet soda, fried foods, beef, ice cream, yogurt, and cheese. Now, when you look at those foods, you might be thinking, oh my gosh, but I like a bowl of ice cream or something. And so some of these things in moderation in very small amounts, it's probably fine. But if these are things that you're eating on a daily basis, this is something you might start to look at even today, is how maybe you can cut down on some of these things. And it may not all happen at once. You may have to do it slowly. What I like to also emphasize is, well, what is it about these foods that seems so wonderful? And what we realize that the more plant-based your diet is, it seems to decrease some sort of inflammatory process. And what we realize with Parkinson's disease and what is affecting those dopamine receptors and causing them not to work is some sort of inflammatory process. And it's escaping everybody the perfect pill to decrease this. But we do know that a diet that is higher in plant-based foods helps that process, or helps decrease that process, and helps in delaying the progression of Parkinson's. And we also find that your plant-based diet is what's going to feed those healthy bacteria. And those healthy bacteria then signal to other parts of our body for cancer prevention and brain health. It's part of that progression that helps in decreasing the progression of those kind of problems. So of course, when we look at plant-based eating, what does that mean? What do I have to do? What are you going to have me change? So I like to just summarize right here is one place to start. If some of you have to leave at this moment, this is probably the best slide for you to remember. I like to say, try to work in some way to have 2 fruits a day, vegetables 5 to 7 a day. Try to make one that's kind of a deep green. Now that can be arugula in a salad, that can be kale blenderized into a smoothie or put into some soup. And also raw food, including some sort of raw food. Now, eating a lot of raw food, you just think, I'd be chewing all day. But it just as long as you have one, I think that's really important, because food in a cooked form versus raw form is very different, and the nutrients and the nutrient availability also changes. So I like to throw in here, how do you do this? I mean, I think it's really easy for people to say, eat your vegetables, eat your fruit, but sometimes you just want some ideas. So I want to just throw some things out there, and maybe you want to even just scribble one thing down now that you could go, you say to yourself, I could do that. You may not think all these things you can do at once, but maybe you can do 1 or 2. So an easy way that doesn't take a lot of chewing is to maybe grate some vegetables and fruit into a salad or a pasta or a grain dish. We went to a office party the other night, and they had this big serving platter of pasta, and we didn't eat it all. So of course we took a bunch home, and we didn't know what to do with it. And it was kind of boring by itself. I think it might have had a little bit of oil over it. But we invited some friends over for leftovers. And what we did is just chopped up all sorts of vegetables, stir fried them, heat up the leftover pasta, and threw in all these vegetables. And it made a really fun, low-key dinner. So, you can just take something you always cook and add some vegetables to it. Maybe instead of chopping, because sometimes chopping can be hard on your hands and takes a lot of time. Maybe you could just rip up pieces of greens. Kale is a good way to do this, or spinach, and just throw them into a soup or casserole. You can get a lot of spinach into a soup because it breaks down from maybe 2 or 3 cups down to about a ½ cup once you throw it into a soup. So that's an easy way to add some things in. Sometimes if you have a high-speed blender, I recommend taking some vegetables. You could lightly steam them. You don't even need to cut them up that much. You could steam them and then throw them into a high-speed blender and make a sauce. Pour it over pasta, pour it over rice, pour it over a baked potato. And that's something that could last you a couple nights. Or you could take that same soup that you made the night before with some vegetables in it, pour that into a blender, add more vegetables, and pour that over pasta. So there's a lot of ways you can do these things and add more vegetables to your diet without feeling like you have to sit there with a plate of vegetables and just eat them. You can make a fruit vegetable smoothie. You can take just basic eggs and you can add garlic, which I consider a vegetable. You can add other greens, you can add onions, and just doctor up your eggs. You can substitute some vegetables for maybe some of the meat in a recipe. So for example, let's say you're having a meat chili, maybe take out half the meat and add more vegetables to it. You can add an extra layer of vegetables into a sandwich. Maybe you want to layer some avocado in it, some tomatoes, and maybe zucchini slices. You can use vegetable sticks in place of crackers. That's an easy way. With fruit, it's interesting. Just, I think 2 months ago, I saw an interesting study come out on fruit. And I don't like to over push fruit because then you get a little more sugar than maybe you need, and sometimes overdoing the sugar every day isn't also the best thing for the brain, but berries and your fresh fruit is important. I really recommend the berries, especially based on this last study I saw, and it was based on patients with Parkinson's, and they noted that people that just ate berries alone on a regular basis, it did improve or maintain their activities of daily living just a little bit better than people who didn't have the berries in their diet. So I thought that was interesting. And fresh or frozen vegetables are best. I don't really recommend a lot of canned vegetables. But I don't know how many of you have a Costco near you, but they have huge bags of organic frozen berries that work great. You can just let them thaw in a bowl or throw them into a smoothie. So any of those would work well. I also like to recommend with vegetables, best is raw, steamed, or boiled, or frozen bagged is fine. Probably minimize the canned. Baked and roasted are going to be your best ways to cook them, or steamed. Grilled, fried, deep fried is probably going to be your least healthy way. That's not to say you can't have it like that occasionally, but try to keep that to a minimum. And I do encourage organic when you can afford it, when it's possible. If I was giving this talk in the summer, I would say go to all your farmers markets and see what you can find. A lot of times there is a place that you can get organic vegetables and, you know, maybe freeze some of them for the fall. I also like to encourage a little bit of fermented food because this also kind of helps your gut make that healthy bacteria I mentioned. And there's a lot of easy ways to do that. Sauerkraut, I recommend the kind not in vinegar. It's kind that's just canned in salt and water. It's usually in the refrigerated section of the grocery store. Miso is something, it's kind of a paste. It comes as a rice or a bean or a soy, and you can even just add a little bit to a soup. You know, it's and same with sauerkraut. I'm not talking about sitting down and eating a cup of sauerkraut, just adding a tiny bit to a meal, kind of as a little not hors d'oeuvre, kind of like I'm forgetting the word, but it's just like a garnish, I guess is you know the way to think of it. Natto, that's also more of a Japanese kind of fermented food, kind of also like a paste. Tempeh is tofu that's been marinated. You could use a probiotic yogurt. There's some made from coconut milk, which I really like. Kombucha is fine too, but you have to be careful which ones you buy. I recommend you buy those that are less than 5 grams of sugar. The other ones are kind of like a sugar water, and they put the label kombucha on them. Kimchi you could use, it's not people's favorite, but if you have access to it and want to add it as a little garnish to your meal, those all would work well too. So those are just some ideas. Want to talk a little bit about protein. We get protein from a lot of different foods. Meat, poultry, cheese, and eggs are most popular. But I want to challenge you to maybe consider some plant-based sources of protein in the form of an organic tofu, dried cooked beans, raw nuts, even fish. It's not plant-based, but it is more your preferred source of protein, especially based on like the study that Dr. Mishley is working on. So all of those would be good choices. The only thing I probably could say here about soy is if you are on a thyroid medication, you just want to make sure you don't have your soy product at the same time you take your thyroid medicine. Most people don't. And then looking at protein in general, I like to show this slide because it kind of shows what are probably our best sources of protein. Again, at the top is your plants, your tofu, your soy, and it can be soybeans like edamame. It can be beans, it can be eggs, again, fish. And then as you get down to poultry, red meat, and dairy, those aren't quite as desirable to use on a regular basis, a daily basis. So how can you go about adding more plant-based protein to your food? Maybe you want to think about taking half the meat out of a recipe and add beans. You can do that easily with soups, minestrone soups, chilies. Maybe you want to consider some different blended dips. A lot of us can think of hummus as something, but there are a lot of other ones out there. There's some made with eggplant. There's some made with white beans. And so that can be a great way to get some of that plant-based protein in. You can make your chili and again, add more beans than meat or add all beans to it. You can top a potato with leftover chili. You could make a stir fry with vegetables and maybe tofu. You could make an egg fried rice and maybe add in some beans or more vegetables or tofu. So these are just sort of different ways for you to look at food, because I think we all have some preconceived ideas of what a chili is, what scrambled eggs are. Well, how could you just change that a little bit? There's also vegetarian lasagna out there that you also, you could either make it or if you were out somewhere, get it. The best ways to cook meat, fish, and poultry is poached in a crock pot or boiled. Roasted and baked are okay, but just kind of be careful not to eat a lot of fried or barbecued or grilled. You change the composition and the chemical composition of the food when you do that. And then we have,
speaking, I can do it. Joan, do you want to take some questions about some of the protein and some of the things? A couple things have come in from the chat.
Let's do it.
Okay, so one was a question about Dr. Mishley's work. Do you know if it's been peer reviewed as far as her studies? Do you have knowledge of that? I don't have knowledge of that. So
as far as what?
So the question is, has Mishley's work been peer reviewed? From what I've heard, it seems her data collection is based on not on food diaries, but on memory.
She has a questionnaire that she has people fill out. Yeah, she's tracking them. By my understanding, she's tracking them through a questionnaire that she has them complete, and that could be the part that's by memory. People recalling what they're eating. Yeah.
Yeah, and I know she's presented some of the initial findings at some of the MDS conferences and stuff. So I know that there is some review of it. I just don't know the extent of it. So, but I also can send out the link to some information about her studies that have been, published.
Yeah, and the fact that she's on PubMed, usually in order to get an article on, and a lot of these are on PubMed or to get it published, you have to have some sort of peer review.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, whether everybody agrees with it is another story. But I think just to emphasize what I do like about it work, and granted, recalls aren't the best. We tend to sometimes exaggerate things. It's not exact. And in general, that is a problem with nutrition related studies is tracking change, and tracking change in a way that you really see what's really what you're causing to happen in somebody, because the change is very gradual. So it can be tricky. But what I can say, and why I quote her work a lot, is it's very consistent. Before, I should back up. Before I finished my book before this information was released. And so I felt pretty confident with all the articles that I reviewed that it was pretty consistent with a lot of other information that was out there.
Sure.
So
Okay.
I hope that answers the question. Okay.
Okay, and then a couple of questions about protein.
Yep.
Why raw nuts are unsalted, dry roasted okay?
Yes. Okay. So my only concern why I say raw is because a lot of the nuts out there, you buy them in a jar, they're dry roasted with some oil on it. And I think sometimes the way they're roasted, and by the time they're canned or bottled or whatever, they lose a lot of their nutrient quality through that process. Now, salt I really don't care about, but it's if they're roasted, I just get concerned that either the oil they're using is more inflammatory, or by the roasting process, you've lost some of the nutrient value. But if you want to take the nuts yourself and pour some salt on them, and maybe just mix them with a little bit of oil, not necessarily heat them up and fry them or something, but just roll them in some oil and then throwing them on a salad or throwing them into a dish, I think that's fine.
Okay. And will you just repeat two pieces? One about why plant-based protein versus the other proteins, like why is that like the top of the list? And then why is dairy the last on the list?
Oh, okay. Yeah, so with protein, what pretty consistently we're finding with plant-based protein, not that you need to become a vegetarian, but we're finding that the plant-based proteins have more phytonutrients that are anti-inflammatory. We find it feeds the healthy bacteria in the gut, promoting a healthy gut flora, which actually helps support brain health. Constipation tends to be a big problem in Parkinson's disease. So if you eat a lot of animal-based protein, it's going to be a little harder to get your fiber. And then again, some of these studies are just, and I may be repeating myself a little bit, but they really are just showing that the animal proteins, especially the beef and the chicken, is potentially associated with more progression. And then with regard to dairy, way back in the 60s, when they were looking at diet, they found pretty consistently that high dairy intake was found in people with Parkinson's disease. And we don't know if that's because of the PCBs that we found in milk back in the 60s that is no longer present now. And it seemed more prevalent in milk and milk drinkers rather than people just had, you know, some cheese or ice cream. But I did think it was interesting that Laura Mishley's work actually still saw that correlation. So, and we don't, you know, that chemical is no longer should be in much milk. So I don't know if there's something else in milk. We're not really sure. So I say you don't have to totally omit it, but if you didn't just like, if you really crave milk, you know, maybe keep it down to just 1 glass a day or a half glass a day, or, you know, your dairy in general, maybe just keep it to 1 serving a day.
Okay, great. Thank you. And I'm going to take a pause on the questions and let you move on, and then we'll get back to questions a little later.
Okay, that's great. I like this approach. Just stop me. That's
All
great.
right. Thanks, Joan.
Okay, you bet. Okay, and so we come to grains, and I think with grains, again, we think bread, cereals, bagels, pastry, that's grains. But what I want you to do is think a little bit outside the box to what I like to call intact grains. And this is oatmeal, brown rice, wheat, but wheat in the form of the whole grain, like wheat berries, couscous is an example. Rye, just using the actual grain, maybe making a cereal, not a cereal, but a use it in place of maybe rice, millet, quinoa, teff, even barley. Barley is a lovely grain that gets kind of neglected, but you know, having a barley-based soup or something, all these are, when you take in the whole grain, which you often don't get from breads and cereals, you get it more refined, you get more nutrients and you get more fiber. So just think about those a little bit more. I want to talk a little bit about convenience foods because some of you may be thinking, well, this is all great, but I live by myself and it's very hard to cook and prepare meals by myself. And maybe you do need to rely on convenience foods occasionally, you know, like a pot pie. So here's what I'd suggest you do to make that a little healthier. Try to buy organic convenience foods as much as you can, and then add another vegetable to the dish. Let's say maybe make a nice salad, or maybe you add a little side of some baked beans to it. Maybe you add a little cubed tofu. Maybe you add a baked potato, or maybe pick a good rice or a grain like barley or quinoa and have that with your dish, or maybe just make a salad. But instead of just having the convenience food by itself, add something else to it where you get a few more plants. And then again, we sort of talked about milk. I just encourage less is best. And for a number of reasons. Oh, whoops, I'm ahead of myself. So what I'd suggest, first of all, if you're worried about getting enough calcium, which we do want, you might consider some fortified calcium beverages instead of just milk. You might try soy milk, almond milk, rice milk. There's calcium fortified orange juice that would work fine. Blackstrap molasses is a good source of calcium. Maybe cooking a little bit of kale or collard greens and throwing that into a soup or a smoothie. And then trying to keep your milk and dairy to about 1 cup a day, or about 2 ounces of cheese per day. If you're using calcium supplements, I don't recommend more than 700 milligrams a day of a calcium supplement. The rest should really come from food. And I guess I would also like to say, if you do start a calcium supplement, always check with your provider. If you have severe uh, stenosis or something in some of your blood vessels, if you've had a history of some plaque, the doctor may want to be a little more cautious with you about using a calcium supplement. And then keep in mind what causes us to lose bone. Again, I'm talking nutrition. There's a lot you can do with activity, but I'm focusing on nutrition. One, just be careful of a real high salt diet. And most of our salt comes from processed foods, not if you just want to shake a little salt on your eggs. I don't worry about that. It's more your processed convenience foods where you get that extra salt. Anything that has phosphates in it, there's a number of dark colas, bottled drinks, and processed foods, you will see the word phosphates or PHOS. And that's a type of phosphorus that actually, it kind of competes with calcium in the bone. So I just encourage you to be careful of those. I want to touch on fat a little bit. We always think fat's the bad guy, but it's really not, unless you're frying food. If you're frying the food like a meat and frying it high fat, tends to be more damaging to your health. Where fats become very healthy if they're in food, if it's a fat added to your food. So example, maybe pouring avocado oil on something, or lightly cooking something in avocado oil or olive oil, almond oil, coconut oil. Coconut oil, it's kind of a balance. There are some properties to coconut oil we think are very advantageous to brain health. If you have a very high cholesterol level, you may need to watch the coconut oil a little bit. But a nice mix of these oils is good. When you get into excess butters, margarines, mayonnaise, gravy, sauces, then the oils don't turn as healthy for our brain health. But adding olive oil to a salad, pouring it over some vegetables is great. Flavors that heal, I just say any spices are great. Just find some way to add them on. If you're going to cook rice, throw some rosemary on it, throw some sage, throw it into a chili. You don't need to be a connoisseur of spices, just throw it in. It's all good for you. Cinnamon has gained a lot of interest in Parkinson's. What we find is cinnamon tends to help decrease what we call the alpha-synuclein buildup on the dopamine receptors that cause them not to work. And we see this mainly in rats, but we have seen it a little bit in humans as well. So I recommend trying to get cinnamon in whenever you can. I recommend organic, and the kind that's been emphasized the most is what's called Ceylon. It's a type of organic cinnamon, but basically any of the organic. And the main reason for that is because a lot of cinnamon, if you really get into it and use it a lot, it potentially can affect the liver. But if you use Ceylon, it somehow doesn't cause the same effect on the liver. So in summary, what I'm kind of talking about here is a Mediterranean diet. And if you can go on Google and get all sorts of images of this, but it's basically more of a high plant-based diet, keeping fish and seafood as your other good source of protein, with poultry and dairy and meat kind of being in the middle. Of course, eggs are one of the things that is probably the only thing that's a little different here would probably almost put it in the realm of fish and seafood, but again, kind of that format. I always like to bring up alcohol, you know, because a lot of people think, well, is that going to make Parkinson's worse? And actually, it probably doesn't make it worse, but in general, alcohol for overall brain health can be impacted. And so I guess what I'm trying to say here is alcohol doesn't specifically damage that part of the brain that's not producing dopamine, okay? But on a larger scale, we think maybe it can, but it does have some benefits. It can clear bad cholesterol. It can decrease inflammation, but it's the high intake that we think is related to memory problems and Alzheimer's. And of course, as we know about Parkinson's, Parkinson's isn't dementia. It's not loss of memory. I mean, with Parkinson's, yeah, it may take you a little longer to say what you want to say, but it's not going to affect your memory. It's not going to necessarily cause Alzheimer's, but you want to protect your whole brain anyway, right? And so with alcohol, I like to say it's kind of a J curve, because what we find is people that don't drink at all, that may not be so healthy. And people that drink a lot, that may not be so healthy. And oh, I forgot to add, yeah, sometimes alcohol can suppress your immunity. So I liked it. My guideline on what's too much, because sometimes you tell people you can have 1 glass a day, and it's like the woman in the picture, all right, here's my glass. And that isn't what we're talking about. So the risks are higher for some of these negatives associated to alcohol if you take in what we say 30 units of alcohol a week, okay? So 2 units is equal to a beer, or 5 to 7 ounces of wine. So basically what we're saying here is probably no more than a beer a day, or a 5 to 7 ounce glass of wine. Or basically you could say having 1 drink, you know, which is a little healthier, 1 day a week, or maybe a little less than that, is best for your health. Oh, one other thing I do want to say about alcohol, though, is sometimes alcohol, this is very individual, but be careful how it affects your balance. I talked to somebody the other day whose husband, he drinks too much, but he has Parkinson's and he falls pretty easily. He's a little more progressed, but he drinks like a pretty big serving of vodka every day, and he's falling all over. He has cuts on his head. He's had stitches. And so pay attention to what alcohol is doing to your balance and how you're able to move around. And if it's affecting that, then you may have to cut down even more. Coffee, is it good? Is it bad? Overall, we find there are many benefits to caffeine with Parkinson's. 200 to 400 milligrams a day can extend the benefits of your medicine, may stimulate dopamine production, which we want. And dark coffee actually may be brain protective up to 4 cups a day for Alzheimer's prevention. But of course, be careful, because some of us have to quit drinking that after about 11 in the morning because it affects your sleep. I also like to just emphasize hydration. I think this gets neglected, not just with regard to Parkinson's, blood pressure management, and just making sure you don't get dehydrated, but your overall brain health. And the thing to keep in mind is whether you have Parkinson's disease or not, your mechanism for thirst recognition decrease with aging. And I'm 67, and I notice that in myself. I can go all day and not drink, and I have had to start forcing myself to drink water. I just don't think about it. And it's very critical. What we find is it probably has a role in our overall brain health. So you have to figure out what works for you. I know for me, I just wake up in the morning, and whether I like it or not, I drink 2 big glasses of water. I start my day that way, and then try to drink a glass in between meals, to, get close to 8 glasses. Now, if you have a cup or 2 of coffee in the morning, you will hear many providers say, oh, that's not a liquid, you can't count that. But honestly, you can count it, okay? Where the misinformation came about caffeine and being causing dehydration is if you very seldom drink coffee, and then it can act more as a diuretic than if you're just routinely drinking 1 or 2 cups a day or 4 cups a day. It doesn't have quite the diuretic effect. And just coming back to constipation, this is a real problem for a number of people. If you don't have that, consider yourself very lucky. And there's many things that you can try. I really like to emphasize psyllium and flaxseed meal and chia seeds for constipation, because you can make some fun stuff with it. And I'm going to put some links at the end where you can learn some things. You can add these into your food instead of, maybe some of you don't mind a little bit of prune juice, like a 1/4 cup, or dried prunes, but sometimes you just want something different. And again, this is where beans become important, because they're so high in fiber and they're so good at helping with our regularity. And then last but not least, your fluid is super important. I also, and I guess final is sometimes dairy actually, and this is something I should have brought up earlier, but sometimes dairy is constipating. This varies, but there's some casein morphines in dairy. It's kind of a derivative of morphine, which is a painkiller. And if you've ever been on painkillers, they make you constipated. And dairy has some of that in it naturally, so that some people it can have that effect. I've helped people a lot with their constipation just by saying don't eat dairy. And they're like, oh, well, that was easy. So here's some more information on, powerhungry.com is a website, and just some information how you can work chia seeds in. There's lots of recipes online for making chia pudding, chia oatmeal, fruit paste, but that's really important. Medications, don't want to say a lot here. I'm not sure how many of you are taking cinnamon or carbidopa, levodopa, but the way cinnamon works, it needs to have a direct pathway to your brain. And for some people, not all, but for some people, if they eat a high protein breakfast like eggs and, have a high protein smoothie, that could affect the absorption of the cinnamon into the brain. This often happens for people who have been on the medication for several years. So it may not pertain to many of you here, but just sort of keep that in mind. If you find, gee, that medicine worked good yesterday, why am I a little off today? Maybe kind of do a check on yourself. Did you have a lot of protein for breakfast? It's not that you can't have some, but you just don't want to have like a 3-egg omelet, for instance. So here's the rule of thumb. Try to limit real high protein foods with breakfast and lunch, because that's when you want the cinnamon to work the best. And that would be just having a lot of meat, fish, eggs, meat in those first 2 meals, and making your dinner meal probably your highest protein meal. Sometimes really high fat, greasy foods can do that too, but I would first look at the protein. I just want to emphasize again here that also constipation can affect how your carbidopa levodopa works also. So if you find again, gosh, it was working well for a while and now it's not, do a check on yourself. There are little things you can check off and go, oh, I haven't gone to the bathroom in a few days. Or, you know, just make sure you check that off your list before you ask the doctor to increase your medication. So just some things to think about. And then just ideas for evening meals, high protein foods, 3 egg omelets, adding vegetables, bean burritos, bean casseroles, having just eating vegetables and maybe rice or green with fish or tofu. All these can be great ways to really get that high load of protein at night. And the reason I say at night is because that's usually the part of the day where if you're a little stiffer, if you don't feel like, you know, doing a lot, you don't care if your medication is impacted a little bit, but during breakfast and the daytime, you kind of want to be moving and active. So that's why we usually say have that higher protein meal in the evening. I do want to bring up Aslect or Rasaline, if any of you are on that. And sometimes that's a first line that some providers will use before they try cinnamon or carbidopa levodopa. And probably your provider that talked to you went over these. But so the only thing I want to emphasize here is some pharmacists, not the providers, but the pharmacists will tell you to restrict tyramine in your diet on this medicine, and you don't need to. Now, you can still have some pickled foods, cured meat, aged cheese a little bit, because we talked about cheese, and beer on tap. Those are normal high tyramine foods. If you have a little bit of those, that is not going to be a problem with that medicine. Supplements, real quick. Some of the more promising ones, of course, vitamin D3, your B vitamins, your folate, N-acetylcysteine has showed some promise. Debatable as coenzyme Q10, omega-3 fatty acids, and alpha lipoic acid. I just read a study because you know, a lot of people, if you're somebody in the group that's looking at ketogenic diets that have been discussed with Parkinson's, and I'll only answer questions on that if I'm asked, but I'll just say I don't think it's a very sustainable diet. But there are keto supplements that if you even want to address that issue or try it, you can buy them. They're called exogenous ketones, BHB, beta hydroxybutyrate, and you could take a couple of them a day, and what it's going to do is give you a few of the ketones that you would get if, let's say, you followed a ketogenic diet. And so there is some promise that maybe that can be of help in getting the brain to work a little bit more on ketones that might be protective. Only supplements I say be careful of are manganese and iron. Don't ever take those unless you talk to your provider. Now, there is a disorder called restless leg syndrome, where you just have this irresistible need to move your legs. It also is a brain dopamine disorder. It does not mean if you just have that problem, you're going to get Parkinson's disease. But sometimes people with Parkinson's disease also have this. 10% of the US population has this. And it's like you say, it's this irresistible urge to move your legs. There's some medications that work. Sometimes it has to do with some problems in your metabolism and use of iron. And your provider can check your ferritin level and see if maybe you would benefit from a little bit of iron. Again, this is something I strongly urge you to check with your provider about. Don't start iron unless they're watching you very closely and watching your iron levels. So in closing, I like to say, play with food. I hope by listening to this that you get some new ideas that, oh, I'll try a new vegetable. I'll add this vegetable to this dish. I'll take some meat out of this one and add some beans. But, just get yourself thinking a little outside the box. And one non-nutrition thing I like to encourage, because they actually can be inflammatory, is limit a lot of cooking with plastic and microwave, or I should say limit plastic and microwave cooking with plastic. Limit as many preservatives, dyes, and colorings in your food. Look at your labels. Try to pick the ones that have the least number of chemicals. Now, I also encourage you maybe to think about some new kitchen gear. I think if you don't have a high-speed blender, it's a great way to limit some of the work involved in food. Same with food processors. It does a lot of chopping for you. Your crock pots or Instapots can make cooking a little easier and make food smell good. One of the things that we find helps people get hungry is the smell of food. And if you have something sitting on the stove all day, filling the house with nice smells, you're going to eat it. You're going to enjoy it. But if you just throw something in the microwave for a minute or two, you're not really getting smell. You might smell something burning actually. And so your crock pot gives you that old fashioned, grandma's cooking in the kitchen. So kind of a step 3 plan, adding more plant-based foods to your diet, try to clean up some toxins, maybe consider some supplements as your budget allows. And I have all this in a handout, so I think, Jen, you have that, but I can send it again. And just some places you can get some fun ideas. And like Jen mentioned, I do have a book that goes over quite a few of these concepts. I do have some recipes. If you just need more ideas or want some more in-depth research that was done on these topics, this book is available on Amazon. It's also available in Kindle. So I'll just close here and give you a chance to ask me more questions.
Okay, great. I couldn't find my mute button. Thank you. There are some questions in the chat, if I can figure out where that button is. And feel free to unmute yourself and ask questions if you would like. Couple of things. Let's see. Manganese and spinach. Apparently spinach is very high in manganese. Would you agree with that?
All of your greens are going to be a little higher. I tend to just say avoid the supplements. That's where you tend to get the most of it. Now, if you're using spinach and making spinach salads every day, probably switch grains or switch greens. But usually when you're getting these foods, these nutrients in foods, they're not the problem, it's the supplements.
Do we need to take magnesium with calcium?
It can help with the absorption of, calcium and magnesium can kind of work together to increase your calcium absorption. There's a calcium supplement I like to recommend called CalMag. It's by Metabolic Balance, and I like it because it's got the calcium citrate and calcium citrate, magnesium citrate and calcium citrate, I think is a combination, but that's a nice balance. And sometimes in general, magnesium can be good. 50% of us are probably deficient in magnesium. And one of the things our provider I know does here a lot is she'll recommend magnesium oxide. And magnesium oxide isn't a super good absorbed form of magnesium, but it does help you a little bit if you're having constipation problems. I, of course, like to try food first, but if you need a little extra help and you don't want to take Metamucil, sometimes taking some magnesium oxide can help as well.
Okay,
Could you
great.
explain the difference between magnesium and manganese? People seem to be getting those two confused.
They're really easy to get confused, but they're totally different minerals. And it's the manganese that they have found a toxicity level in certain people that get Parkinson's disease. They found it mainly, I want to say, in mines where people worked that were exposed to high levels of manganese. But it's very different minerals.
Yes. People should be aware of that.
I know, and it's yeah, probably should make a better point of that, so thank you.
So speaking of sort of, if you're going to try some supplements, I know that sort of the vitamin and supplement market isn't very well regulated. So do you have any tips on trying to find the best, the best supplements, the ones that actually have what it says they have in it?
Yeah.
Is there like a reliable way to do that?
Yeah, you can get, oh, hold on just a second. Sorry. Oh, wait, I have it. I'm just looking for, okay. Yeah, in my book, I kind of go over that, but the three things, I have to refresh my memory, so I'm sorry. There's three kinds of labels that you can look for, and one is I'm just drawing a blank on the label. Well, I'm not finding it off the top of my head in here, but
Try buying at Costco. They vet everything.
yeah, Costco is not bad. Oh, here it is. I'm sorry. Okay, so the regulatory seals you're looking for is GMP, Good Manufacturing Practices, and there's also a code called NPA, which is the National Product Association. There's also two other regulatory groups called NSF, and there's one called the TGA, which is Therapeutic Good Administration Certification. So any of those labels, you're going to be a little more guaranteed of a pretty reliable source. If some of you, one of the things I did when I wrote my book is I went to some, there is a web page called, that has to do with monitoring nutrients that are out there, and they actually take products and they analyze them to say what they have in them. And in my book, that is something I did when I selected some of the products that I have in my book as well.
Okay. Okay.
Okay.
So can you say, do plant proteins provide as much tyrosine as meat and dairy? And is tyrosine something needed for dopamine production?
Yeah, tyrosine is one of the nutrients, along with the iron and protein in general, that can support dopamine production. Tyrosine is a, yeah, I'd have to go back. The biggest limiting amino acid in plant-based proteins is lysine. Tyramine doesn't tend to be the rate limiting one. So I don't really emphasize that too much. Sometimes I'll suggest a tyrosine supplement to some people that sometimes will make that metabolic pathway work a little bit better. And sometimes that's helpful also for people that have restless legs. But it's not a real rate limiting amino acid. Pretty much it's lysine is the biggest one.
Okay. So any other questions from the audience? I think I got to almost all of them. There was a question about the math being right on the alcohol. So if it's 30 units, one pint of beer is 2 units.
Right.
Would that be 2 drinks a day?
No. So 2 units. Well, so then divide that into 30. So then that would be, oh yeah, that would be 2. Yeah, I guess that is 2. Yeah, so that's considered high drinking.
Yeah.
But
okay.
what is more recommended is probably the lower number, which is half of that, which is about 15 units, around 15 units, which would be about 1 beer, 1 glass of wine. Yeah.
Okay. And then tea. So you talked about coffee like being part of fluid, and is tea with I cannot speak. Tea with caffeine is okay.
Yeah, I would consider if you're using it on a regular basis, I don't see it working as a diuretic. That's yeah. So you can count that as your liquid.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So any other questions? Anybody want to unmute themselves?
Yeah, feel free.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
It was wonderful.
Okay.
All right. Well, then, any parting words on nutrition and Parkinson's and eating for the healthy brain, Joan?
I would leave with just try to eat real food and try to work as much as you can with plant-based foods and have fun while you're doing it. Find things that are fun. Find things you enjoy.
Yeah, great. So I am, folks, going to, we've recorded this. I'm going to stop recording.